Hi, this is Martha from Movie Soup, where Spoiled Juice, and this video is going to be a very detailed review of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. This is a classic novel that I read back in December, and in this video I want to go more into details of the pros and cons that I found in the book. So this is going to be a very spoiler-filled video. So if you haven't read this book, don't watch this video, go read it first, and then you can come back and hear my thoughts on it. So for those who don't know, Jane Eyre was a novel that was published in 1847, and it kind of is written like an autobiography. It tells the story of Jane, who grows up poor, and when she is around like 18, 19, then she applies for a job as a governess, and she goes to work for a guy named Mr. Rochester as a governess. He has adopted a girl who he is quite certain is actually not his kid, but through convoluted reasons he has this kid and he needs someone to take care of this kid. And when Jane is there, then she of course falls in love with Mr. Rochester, and the whole plot kind of takes off from there. And I'm not gonna really like be in any particular order. I'm not gonna like have pros first and then cons. I'm kind of like going to go through more like themes of the novel and then talk about what works and what doesn't. So the first thing about this book is that it's like 500 pages long, and the first 200 pages were really torturous for me. I really dragged my feet with this book. I couldn't get into it. I thought that the language was kind of weird, and I was having trouble relating to Jane. She did like say certain things that I'm I think probably like meant a lot for that time. Like she talked about how, well, people don't understand this, but women have feelings and that kind of stuff. And because they were very specific for that time when this book was written, then I was having trouble connecting to it in a sense. And another problem that I had was the first 200 pages is that we spend a lot of time with Jane talking to Rochester, and I didn't like Rochester at all. I thought that he was very entitled and he was kind of whiny and very smug. He just came off as very unlikable, and like he was fairly nice to his servants, but otherwise he was fairly cold and distant towards Adele, the girl who was in his care. And he could also be like very a little bit emotionally manipulative towards Jane and didn't really treat her always that well. There's a scene where Jane goes to a party because Rochester loves having parties. He throws these big parties with all these rich people. And she is at one of these parties and she hears people saying like condescending and very classist, very hurtful things about governesses. And she has to leave because she gets quite upset about this and she's in tears. And Rochester is kind of like saying to her, like, oh, no, you can't leave, you can't leave. And then when she's like, no, I really have to go, I'm sad. Then he's like, well, very well, but I expect you to then come back to these other parties and entertain my guest. That's not really her job. Her job is a governess. She's there to take care of Adele, not to be like your companion or anything and entertain your guests. Like if you invite the guests, you entertain them. There's also this problem with Adele, and I think like a lot of people don't mention this, but it seemed very odd that he would have Adele there because Rochester doesn't seem to really care much about Adele, and he makes it very blatant that he is very certain that she is not his child, and he is very cold and very distant towards her. And like his only interaction with her seems to be that when he comes back from trips, he gives her a gift, and that's like the only connection that he has to her. He never seems to really talk to her or anything. He's always talking to Jane and kind of like never addresses Adele as a person. And I guess like that's like how it was back then. But it seems like very much like he's going out of his way not to really have any relationship to this kid. And it's kind of like, well, you kind of adopted her, so you might as well form a relationship. And this kind of gave this vibe that I thought that it didn't really make much sense that he would adopt this kid in the first place. because he doesn't seem to really care for her, and he seems to think that she's just like spoiled and obnoxious. And it seemed very like that it was only for plot convenience, that Adele has to be there in order for Jane to then become the governess there. So Adele feels very much more like a pawn than a character, that she is just there in order for Jane and Rochester to meet, because otherwise this whole book wouldn't happen. However, on the pro side, when Jane is gets engaged to Rochester after he plays all these mind games with her, but he finally proposes and they're going to get married, then it turns out that on the day when they're supposed to get married, that he actually has is already married and he has a mad wife in the attic, and Jane has to leave. And the book really takes off in that scene, because like not only is Jane being like very assertive, and she even says that if no one is there for me, I have to learn to be there for myself, which is like a really powerful statement. She becomes a lot more of a stronger and a lot more of a defined character when she then has to go off and be a school teacher and kind of like survive on her own for a while. And it becomes really compelling. And this book is kind of like very much marketed as like this feminist classic. At first, I didn't really get where it was coming from, but in this section of the book, I really understood where all the hype was coming from, because you actually see Jane not only stand up to Rochester and decide that she has to be there for herself and she has to learn to be independent. But when she's working as a school teacher, she very often puts her foot down with the priest who is kind of like running the school, and she doesn't let him boss her around. There's this scene that I think is particularly telling, is when this priest, he wants to marry Jane even if he doesn't really love her, but he thinks that they will be compatible as husband and wife. And Jane says, I don't love you, I don't want to marry you," which itself is quite daring. The priest also then says at some point that, well, you keep rejecting my marriage proposal, and when you reject my marriage proposal, you're going against God. And Jane still says, that doesn't matter, I'm not going to marry you. And the thing is that this book is set in during a time like in the 19th century where everybody was very religious, and Jane herself often talks about God and her faith in the book. So in those times, to not only say no to a priest, but to kind of like say no to a priest even after the priest has said that if you do this thing, you're going against God. That took a lot of courage for that time. But unfortunately, she then decides that at some point, because the priest goes off to South Africa, she returns back to visit Rochester, and it turns out that his wife, the one who was in the attic, has died. And this is like where another con comes in. It probably has been talked about before, but this book is very ableist against people with mental health problems. Bertha, who is Mr. Rochester's mad wife, she is kind of like vilified for being mentally ill. And the way her mental illness is described is very confusing. Like she's setting things on fire, but she's also like stabbing people, but she's also like sometimes she stays in the attic and she's not causing any problems at all. And it really feels like Charlotte Brontë clearly doesn't know anything about mentally ill people. She's just writing a very caricature depiction of them, which probably was very common back then. And she kind of goes into this trope, like this very stereotypical idea that mentally ill people are violent and they're a danger to other people, which is actually not entirely true. It's often the other way around. It's usually people that are mentally healthy that do violence towards people that are mentally ill. Like if anybody has read Elina Hirvonen's When I Forgot, then that novel, for instance, talks about this, about the violence towards people who have mental health problems. And like even before that, this book kind of really hasn't aged very well in a lot of ways. Like there's a line in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre where Mr. Rochester gives Jane a paycheck and he's giving her like a raise. And Jane says that, oh, I don't need this raise, I'm not a Jewish woman. And it kind of is like this very casual anti-Semitic sentence that's kind of like there and it's not really challenged because I guess back then people didn't think anything about these kinds of lines, but it really sticks out like a sore thumb nowadays. And when I read that line in the book, I was kind of like, oh, oh boy, this is really uncomfortable. And Bertha has the same problem that just like Adele, she's more of a plot convenience than a character. She's introduced so that Mr. Rochester and Jane can have angst and that they have to be torn apart. And when the novel is ending, then Bertha conveniently dies so that Jane and Mr. Rochester can then get married. And it really is kind of very odd. And also like this idea that a man would like have a woman locked up in an attic does not bode very well nowadays. Like it's kind of creepy. It kind of really it gives off this very abusive vibe. Like even if Bertha is kind of violent, then it seems also very odd that this man would be kind of keeping a woman up like almost like a prisoner in a way. I guess like it would be worth saying that Rochester actually does become blind and he actually is missing a hand after the fire accident. And I know like some people like there was a woman in the Guardian who praised this for having like a positive disabled body presentation, which I think like that was nice. Jane Jane herself is also like not very good looking. And I like that the book kind of also talked about that, about how Jane feels plain. And people actually say to her that she's plain. So it's not this like, oh, she's beautiful, she doesn't know it. Because I feel like modern audiences get fed that trope quite a bit. Like books like Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, then it's always like that the heroine says like, "Oh, I'm plain looking," but then everyone tells her like, "Oh no, you're actually beautiful. You just don't know it." Uh, in Jane Eyre, Jane actually is plain for real, and it's not a. I mean, it's okay. You know, life works out anyway. And I think like that is like really refreshing to actually have a book that says that like, "Oh no, it's like she's not beautiful. She's plain, but it's okay." And Rochester has the same thing. He's not very good looking, but it's okay. The thing is that he doesn't have a very good personality either, which kind of I think can become a little bit of a problem. But Jane doesn't care much, so I guess it doesn't really matter. So those were my thoughts on Jane Eyre. Uh, you guys have probably read it, so what did you think of it? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Why? I would love to hear your thoughts, so comment down below. And if not, that's okay. If you like this video, click the like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!